NBC Sports presents the third AFL NFL World Championship game, the Super Bowl. The American Football League champions, the New York Jets, versus the National Football League champions, the Baltimore Colts. From the Orange Bowl in Miami, Florida, the city of Miami hosts for this Super Bowl game, and a wonderful host it's been. The temperature right now is 72 degrees. The wind is going to be a factor here. It's gusty now, 15 miles an hour, and we have a 20% chance of rain. It rained last night hard for several hours. The field was covered, though, and appears to be in very good shape. And they could have sold 150,000 tickets for this game. Tickets have never been more scarce than they were here in Miami for the third Super Bowl game. I'm Kurt Gowdy. I'm going to call the play-by-play for you. Analyzing the game will be Kyle Rote and L.D. Rogatis. They were both National Football League stars, and also they followed the AFL this season on television on NBC, so they know both leagues very well. Also, Jim Simpson is going to be with us, and he'll be roaming the field for some interesting interviews. Well, you've all read and heard all kinds of pregame dope during the week. I think one big sidelight has been Joe Namath. Joe Namath, of course, is the man that the Colts have to stop. If Namath has a good day, the Jets are usually good. If he doesn't, they have trouble. But Namath has not been bashful this week. He's come down here to Miami, and he has said that the Jets are going to win. He doesn't even predict it. He said, I guarantee a Jet victory. He has downgraded the opponent, the quarterback, Earl Morrall. And this is supposed to now give Baltimore even more of an incentive, and they say that it has added maybe a 2-touchdown edge to the Colts. We'll see how it all comes out. Joe Namath has been on the spot, but he's even more on the spot now.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey gang, what's new? How you doing? My name is Tim Hanlon, and this is indeed Good Seats Still Available, our curious little podcast journey each and every week into what used to be in professional sports. Last week's discussion was really interesting, and we decided that we would stay sort of in the New York metropolitan area this week as we segue from last week's show about an interesting slice of life during the times of Shea Stadium in New York, Flushing / Queens to be exact. And we thought we'd go this week into one of those teams that called Shea Stadium home for most of its, actually all of its life. No, not the beloved baseball New York Mets, but the Jets, the football New York Jets of the AFL, and then obviously, of course, later the NFL. And as is the want on this show, we try to focus on teams and leagues no longer with us or previous incarnations of such. And the AFL version of the New York Jets is a topic we really have not gone too deeply into. But a new book is out that gives us a pretty darn good excuse to do so. Our guest is Bob Lederer, and he is the author of the brand new book published by Day Street imprint of William Morrow, and it's called Beyond Broadway Joe, the Super Bowl Team That Changed Football. And the thesis of the book and our conversation is an interesting one, right? So as you heard in this little snippet featuring Kurt Gowdy, that was, of course, the intro to the most famous and now legendary Super Bowl III that was played in the Orange Bowl in Miami on January 12th, 1969, between the New York Jets of the AFL champions, and the Baltimore Colts of the NFL champions. And as you may remember, those first 3 years of the not fully merged leagues, right? This Super Bowl, which wasn't even coined the Super Bowl until really this third one, although it may have been referenced informally as such prior, was designed essentially to be sort of the last final game between the two separate leagues before the full-on merger afterwards. And as was sort of described not only in the lead up, right? So Joe Namath taking his New York Jets team into the lion's den, if you will, of the Orange Bowl, they were not expected to be even competitive, let alone win this game. And I think a lot of people, who lived through it sort of remember the fact that the Jets were just gigantic underdogs. I mean, I think the line, the betting line, was the Colts by 18 going into this game. And as you remember in our previous conversations around Baltimore Colts of the NFL of that time, they had just pasted their way. That they pasted the Cleveland Browns in the NFL championship game just 2 weeks prior, and they were a juggernaut, right? With not only Earl Morrall, but of course Johnny Unitas, and they were quite something. The Colts were, and there was this also lingering doubt about sort of the viability and or the credibility and the competitiveness of the AFL and the teams in general. And this was, as we're going to hear in our conversation with Bob in a few minutes, a pivotal game. It wound up becoming quite definitional around the AFL, its value, and frankly, what the NFL became after the full-on merger that happened after this game, Super Bowl III. And a lot of the conversation we're going to be talking about today is not just the obvious stuff about Joe Namath, and that's clearly the easy headline for most of the memories of this New York Jets team. The only, by the way, championship version the Jets experienced, of course, which every New York Jet fan will tell you and lament about as the actual date of 50 years now since the Jets won a championship. It is a sorry state of affairs for lots of different reasons, for another conversation, of course. But, I think it is a really interesting slice that Bob is focused on. It wasn't just Joe Namath. Of course, he the marquee name, the superior talent, a lot of the excitement around the team, no doubt. But let's be honest, one person does not a team make. And as we'll hear in this conversation, Bob got the opportunity to talk with most of the folks that were part of this team. And by the way, not just the 1968-69 team that won the Super Bowl, but frankly, some of the components and the cogs and the pieces that constituted and made up this team as it emerged from its original form in the AFL, that being the New York Titans. A previous episode there, you can look that one up too, with our friend Bill Reisick. But becoming the Jets and then what became ultimately, despite the fact them being huge underdogs, the ultimate champion of the national, the combined NFL and AFL Super Bowl III champions. That's our conversation this week. It's a very interesting one, a subtle one at that. And if you're a New York Jets fan, you remember sort of the days of that dramatic and unexpected quote-unquote world championship. You will enjoy this conversation as I did with our guest, Bob Lederer, coming up in just a couple of seconds. All right, let's get a couple of promotional things out of the way quickly and smoothly because without them, without our sponsors, this show doesn't exist. And we appreciate you considering and hopefully making a purchase or two from our great sponsors to keep us going. Will you? Please? Thank you so much. Oldschoolshirts.com is a good place to start. Oldschoolshirts.com has a bevy of great distressed T-shirts, high-quality stuff. I mean, there are tons of crappy shirts out there in the internet featuring old logos and stuff, but this ain't one of them. Oldschoolshirts.com, thank you, is a bastion of high quality. They are lovingly made. They are very interested in the history of a lot of these teams and leagues. And by the way, it's not just sports franchises and leagues that are no longer with us or previous incarnated, but it's also really cool stuff like old radio station logos and call letters and all other kinds of sort of pop culture things and malls and amusement parks, all that kind of stuff. Oldschoolshirts.com, and they're making all kinds of new ones all the time. So give them a try, and when you go there, please indeed use your promo code GOODSEATS to get 10% off all of your purchases. That's oldschoolshirts.com, promo code GOODSEATS for 10% off. Sportshistorycollectibles.com is an awesome place to go as well. And that is a place where memorabilia of all kinds of teams and leagues no longer with us. Frankly, some of them are still with us, but in previous incarnations and whatnot. And Dean Mitchell and friends out in San Diego are replacing or putting new stuff up there all the time. Very well photographed versions of all these things that you can sort of see and get a real good handle on what you're buying. And you're going to find yourself sucking a lot of time out of your day, as I do often by going through all those cool things. and then considering, I think, of the kind of things you might want to purchase, right? Maybe it's from the AFL, maybe it's from various soccer or baseball or basketball or hockey or golf or whatever. It's all there. And an amazing array of stuff at sportshistorycollectibles.com. And when you finally decide that there is something that you absolutely must have, and I think it's a matter of when, not if, you want to use a promo code there, and that's Good Seats. The promo code Good Seats will get you 15% off all of your purchases early and often at sportshistorycollectibles.com. Again, promo code Good Seats for 15% off all of your purchases there. Okay, and now, last but not least, our friends at 503 Sports in Portland, Oregon, the beautiful Pacific Northwest of our great country. 503 Sports, the king of throwbacks, and the actual website is 503-sports.com or 503-sports.com if you're a persnickety Webster's English dictionary devotee. And at 503 Sports, you're going to find not only some great lovingly crafted T-shirts with the logos and stuff of teams and leagues that you may remember and just maybe have, or perhaps have just forgotten, but also some very awesome and handcrafted limited edition throwback uniforms that are painstakingly put together. They make them only in very small batches. But we're talking about, for teams and leagues no longer with us. And if you really want to show your sports fandom and really stand out, I mean, if you want that old XFL jersey, if you're looking to create a little stir with an old WFL, World Football League jersey, perhaps something from the World League of American Football to confound your friends and say, have them say, what the hell is that and where did that come from? And there was a team in Sacramento called the Surge? What are you talking about? All that stuff and more is yours to find. And frankly, you can even suggest some ideas. They are very open to your suggestions. And that's at 503 Sports. That's 503- or -sports.com. And of course, we've got a promo code for you there. That's Seats. Seats, yes, that's the promo code at 503 Sports. Again, it's 503- or -sports.com. Use that promo code Seats and get 10% off all of your purchases there as well. Please indeed visit them early and often, not just them, but all of our great sponsors. And we thank you for doing so tremendously. All right, let's get to our chat. A very interesting chat. I learned a ton in this conversation, as I often do, but perhaps a little bit more than normal. And I think you're going to find it intriguing as well. Bob Lederer is our guest. Our conversation about the AFL version of the New York Jets and their lead up into the surprising Super Bowl III championship coming right up. There's no question that the Jets, right, and having grown up in the New York metropolitan area, I would call myself more of a Giants fan, but my first ever football game was at a Jet game at Shea Stadium. Again, who knows why? Glutton for punishment, perhaps. But it's clear that the Jets, right, whom we know and partially love today, got their start in the AFL. And a lot of your book centers around, the year and the success of the team in 1968, 1969, culminating in that Super Bowl III championship. But I think a lot of people in today's generation sort of, it's completely lost on them, whether, understanding the dynamics of the Super Bowl and
they have, frankly, I had to add the last chapter, why it changed everything, because my publisher came up with the title for the book. I had Beyond Broadway Joe. They insisted on the Super Bowl team that changed football. And I had told them that verbally, but I had no chapter about that. And so the last chapter in the book is about that. And that probably is the most important part of the book, especially for fans today who, if you're not 60 years old, just don't know what that game did after it was over. It completely. I mean, are we taping now, or what are we doing?
Yeah, we like to start in medias res. So
okay. I mean, just to give you an example, Jerry Philbin and Bob Talamini, two of the really good players on the Jets, both told me in my interviews with them that they had heard rumblings that the NFL was not going to accept all the AFL teams, despite the merger agreement, if the Jets got blown out like Oakland and Kansas City had been. And the two worst franchises easily back then were the Boston Patriots and the Denver Broncos. So imagine if the leagues had merged, quote unquote, and the Patriots and the Broncos didn't exist today. You know, they might have put another team in Boston later and another team in Denver later. Who knows? You know, there's been a lot of franchise shifts in other sports, but where would Tom Brady be today? And where would John Elway have played his football for all the years he played? I mean, and no fan today is at all in touch with that. I mean, I wasn't until I, did this interview. In fact, I talked to some people from the Patriots franchise back then. They knew nothing about it. And yet, Philbin was telling me, he was insistent that he was hearing this in the locker room in the 2 weeks before Super Bowl III was played. And, that's one thing. And then the NFL wanted to take the AFL teams, but before Super Bowl III was played, and Pete Rozelle was going to take the 10 AFL teams or 8 AFL teams or whatever number they were going to take in, and they were going to put them in the National Football League. And the Jets were going to be in the Giants division, and the 49ers were going to be in the same division with the Raiders, and the Oilers were going to be in the same division with the Dallas Cowboys, etc. Okay? So we would not have an AFC today. And we would not have a Super Bowl because they had decided that the AFL teams were so pathetic that there was no point in having this big Super Bowl game, which was always going to be a rout. And so they were going to take the AFL teams that made the playoffs, 4 of them, okay, and they were going to mix them with the NFL teams. And the idea was they would eliminate the AFL teams so that the championship game would end up being an NFL team against another NFL team. That was the plan.
Yeah, that's interesting because, and it really came to light in our conversation a couple of weeks back with Jack Gilden, who wrote Collision of Wills, which essentially is sort of the sort of main meat, I guess, of the 60s in the Baltimore Colts, right? And
yeah.
And it's interesting, and people of a certain generation, right? They don't sort of recognize all this, but to your point, right? Those first 2 Super Bowls, right, were really no contest, and it was
after halftime they were complete mismatches.
No, and the fact that and how the Colts had won the NFL championship in '68, leading into what then was going to be the 1969 Super Bowl in January of that year. They won that going away against the Cleveland Browns. It wasn't even
34-0. It was, and they had beaten the Colts. They'd given the Colts their only defeat that year.
All right. Well, let's wind it back a little bit. Maybe we can set the scene a bit, sort of how this team kind of got to this precipice, and I think, and then we can sort of maybe segue finally into just how dramatic and life altering, I guess. When it comes to
that's fine because that's how the book really is positioned as well.
Well, we can
start the conversation. We can start the conversation there. That's no problem.
No, before we do that, give our audience a sense of why this Jets story in general is of interest to you in the first place. Are you in the industry, so to speak, or how did you sort of come about to pursue this and try to get this documented in book form?
I'm a fan since 1963 when the Titans became the Jets, quite by accident. I turned on WHN one night. And lo and behold, Bob Murphy is doing the Jet game. And I become a Met fan that year. And I went, whoa, what is Bob Murphy doing football? And what is this? And so I listened to it and I went, well, there's no more baseball season. So, I was 12 years old. There's no more baseball season. So I got to have something to keep my attention during, the off season. So I'll follow football. And frankly, it wasn't long thereafter that I started to pay attention to the Knicks and to the Rangers for the same reason. But the Jets always had my interest because I was learning football literally by watching the Jets evolve from a laughingstock, even in the American Football League, to a team each year that was adding 3 or 4 building block players season by season. And I was learning football as I was watching it. And by 66, 67, I was very curious. How good was Larry Grantham? I mean, he was a terrific linebacker in the AFL, but would he be a good linebacker in the NFL? And I looked at Don Maynard and I said, wow, the guy catches, 70, 80 balls a year, and nobody can guard him when he goes deep. How would he do in the NFL? And I looked. The only thing I came to understand that was probably pretty clear was someone like Curly Johnson, who was a punter. I mean, a punter is a punter. If you give him, the time to get his kickoff, there's no difference between the punting and the two leagues. So that was the only thing. By 68, I was really hooked. And I was waiting for this team to live up to the 5-year plan that Eubank had announced when he got hired in 1963. He had taken 5 years, which turned out, I think, to be 6 in Baltimore, before he made them a championship team. And he said he was going to be able to do the same thing in New York. And after the 67 season, where they finished a half a game out of first place, I was really revved up for the next year. And they made 2 big trades in training camp in 68 that signaled to me that this was serious stuff, because they finally got a backup veteran quarterback behind Namath, Babe Parilli, in case Joe got hurt. And they brought in Talamini from Houston, and he was an all-AFL league guard. I couldn't understand how they traded and got an all-AFL guard, and the guy'd been a guard on the All-Star team for 6 years. The guy was a very good football player. And so I figured something was up. Okay, so now we fast forward to the Super Bowl game itself. For 2 weeks, and you know the story. For 2 weeks, we, as every fan, Jet or no, was told the Jets have no chance to win this game. Thank you, Jimmy the Greek Snyder, who went position by position in Vegas and gave points to the Colts, a point or two here advantage in running backs. And I think the only position that he had even was quarterback. He thought Earl Morrall was the equal of Joe Namath. But every other position, offensive line, wide receivers, defensive line, linebackers, everything else, he gave the Colts 1 or 2 points. And when he was done, he had the Colts favored by 17.5 points. I didn't think the Jets were going to win the game. My hope was that they would not get embarrassed. That was really it, because I was surprised by the ease with which Green Bay had beaten Kansas City and Oakland. I thought they were both pretty good teams. And when they won, first of all, as the game started and they got a lead and they held a lead and they kept blunting Baltimore and their offense, I got more and more enthused. I was 16 years old and my hormones were just raging. And my adrenaline and everything else. By the end of the game, I was an incredible high. I was on an incredible high for a week. And I remember going to high school the next day, and I had friends who were Giant fans who, without any exception, came up to me and said, congratulations, your guys deserve to win yesterday. Well, I mean, today they probably rag on me and tell me if they played 99 more times, the Colts would win all 99 of them. But back then, they gave the Jets full credit. And so having experienced the low and the little expectation that they were even going to be in the game, much less win the game, and then to steadily watch that game evolve and the Jets get the lead and then get control of the lead and then win the game was just a startling event. But there was something else, and that is that I was able to watch the entire game on television. Well, what's the big deal with that? Well, I was also a Met fan. The Mets won the World Series that year. They won the World Series in the middle of the week, and the game was played in the afternoon, and I was in high school. I didn't see those 3 games at Shea. I heard about them. I saw some highlights when I got home. The last one, Game 5, when I heard they were winning in the 9th inning, I cut the only high school class I ever cut and walked to the subway where I had to go to get home every day and waited outside the subway until the Mets had actually, clinched it and it was over. So I never got to see that. And then the Knicks won the NBA title the next spring, and the game was blacked out in New York until midnight because ABC didn't want to show it live in New York. So being fans of those three teams, but having really totally experienced the Jets and what happened, I was really into it. But there's another thing, and that was I love Joe Namath. Everybody loved Joe Namath. But I was a bigger fan of Jerry Philbin and of Emerson Boozer than I was of Joe Namath. They really got my attention because of the kind of players they were. And I won't go into it now. We can talk about it when we actually, do the interview. But so I always had this really fascination with all the other guys on the team. And I wrote the book because about 4 years ago, I was sitting in my family room in January, and the NFL Network was showing Super Bowl III. And my two boys, who were both teenagers, were sitting, and I said, hey, I want you to watch this game. This is a very, very critical game in the history of the National Football League, and I want you to see how the Jets won. And I'm sitting here and watching it, and one of my sons points out Philbin. Boy, he looks like a good player, and I told him about Jerry Philbin. And then the other son says to me, Winston Hill, that 75 playing left tackle, he's killing the Colts. And I said, yeah, the guy was an all-pro at left tackle 4 times, and then he became an all-pro at right tackle 4 times. And he should be in the Hall of Fame. And I'd always wanted to write a book because I'm a writer by trade. And my wife walked in, and she said, so when are you going to write a book about these guys already? And I said, I haven't had an angle on the book until just now. And she says, and what's the angle? And I said, I'm going to talk to everybody else on the team not named Namath. And I'm going to get their stories of what happened that year. And that's how the book came about.
So why don't we get our audience a little bit sort of in the early days of your Jet fandom, right? Because it's clear being a Jets fan from the earliest days, right? Or at least when they were reincarnated from the Titans. And we had a really good conversation about the Titans with Bill Reitzik.
His book is great.
And it's it's certainly whitewashed, I think, right? Because people sort of forget about that. But
that's why I loved it, because I knew almost nothing that he wrote about in that book.
So that's interesting. So give us a sense then, as a fan, a young fan, probably very full of alacrity and interest and sopping up just about everything you can about this team. How do you become a Jet fan? What did you know of the Titans? And I suspect that first year, right, was, going to games at the Polo Grounds, which is probably not the most exciting and fun experience.
I went to one Jets game in the 60s.
Oh, interesting.
So I couldn't afford to go. I lived in Flushing, right by the ballpark. At first I lived near the Unisphere, 2 miles away from the ballpark. And then I moved with my family to another part of Flushing, and I figured it out, I was 3 miles away. But I only went to one Jet game because it was fairly expensive. I think a ticket was $12 or $15, which for a teenage kid, I didn't have that kind of money, and my dad wasn't going to give me that kind of money to go to a game either. So do me a favor and just kind of cut me off, because as you can hear, I can get pretty wound up and start to talk. Well, no,
that's right. So, all right. So then tell me how this Jets thing came into being. Like, maybe you can regale the audience a bit in how did this sort of renaming of the team and this repositioning of the team?
Well, you know what? I'll be honest with you. I didn't even know there was a Titans. I was completely in the dark. I became a sports fan in 1963, like as I mentioned before. Became a Mets fan. I turned on Channel 9 one day, and it was the bottom of the 9th inning, and the Mets were losing at the Polo Grounds, 3-2. And Ron Hunt came up with guys on second and third and knocked them both in with a single with 1 or 2 outs in the bottom of the 9th. And I immediately said, wow, I'm going to become a Mets fan. And so I started watching the games on Channel 9 and listening to the games on the radio. The season ended, and that was it. And then, as I mentioned to you, I just happened to turn on WHN one Saturday night while I was at my grandma's apartment, and heard Bob Murphy doing the game. And I just decided right then and there, well, like I said, the baseball season's over. I have to entertain myself some other way. So it was football. And like I also mentioned, several weeks later, it became basketball and it became hockey.
So it almost seems to me that, and maybe it's your young impressionable age, or maybe I don't know. We'll talk to other.
That's what it is. When you're 12 years old, and you really don't have any other outside interests. My grandmother tried to get me interested in stamp collecting, and that was fine. But
it's also a testament, though, to I guess what was the marketing of a team, right? With a brand new stadium, right, that itself was originally designed for, I guess, at the beginning, as a Continental League baseball team that never materialized.
That was the idea, but it didn't really get its start until the Met franchise was created by the National League. And you know, the thing, part of it is, to be honest with you, Tim, because I lived in Flushing, I didn't just look at the Jets and the Mets as my team to root for. I literally thought of them as my backyard team. It's like, you know, it's like here in Chicago, if you live in Wrigleyville, you know, the Cubs they're not only your team, but, you know, you can reach out and touch them. The ballpark is around the corner.
So besides that WHN AM 1050 broadcast and Bob Murphy, how much overlap was there with the Mets? Like I've seen in
nothing, because the season was well underway, I believe, and the Mets season, you know, in those days the season ended in September. The World Series was over by early October.
No, but I mean in terms of the sort of relationship, if you will, or sort of the guilt by association. You know, you had two new teams in that brand new stadium. You know, my research, I've got an ad that shows, you know, a Bill Gallo cartoon showing how Mets manager Casey Stengel was essentially entrusting the Jets faithful with the Mets audience. It was almost like a blessing.
Well, and don't forget, you know, back then there was a conscious effort, because the Mets had become so popular, to rhyme with the Mets. So you had the Jets, and the Nets came not far thereafter. So, you know, it was just something that people did. They were trying to rhyme with the team that had won a lot of people's hearts, even though they couldn't win many games.
So give us a sense then of those early years of you being a fan, and frankly also this thing called the AFL, right, which is a whole new construct as well, right? The NFL, and you know, you as a brand new fan, right, maybe sort of didn't understand sort of the history or the heritage of the NFL, or maybe you did. How much of this was the Jets? How much of this was the AFL? How much of this was New York? Give us a sense of sort of being a fan of this team in this renegade league during the early to mid 1960s.
I didn't think of it as a renegade league. I didn't think of the American Football League as anything other than the fact that I couldn't watch it on TV. In '63, ABC still had the games, and they had a game of the week. And I do not recall watching a Jet game on the ABC AFL game of the week that entire season. My first recollections of the Jets come the next year when NBC has a contract, and the road games are televised. So that's when I started to really be able to watch these guys play. I just thought of these guys as, you know, football players, and I had no cognizance of whether these guys were any good, except the Jets lost a lot of games. They were 5-8-1 in '63 and in '64 and in '65. And yet I had the sense they were getting better, even though their record wasn't getting any better. And that was because the league was getting better. And I didn't really, you know, have much knowledge about that either. I just started to read everything I could get my hands on. And in those days, there were any number of newspapers in New York City. And so I would just grab as many as I could get. I didn't go out and buy everything, but I remember we had the Herald Tribune being delivered at home, and my grandmother read the Daily News, and so I'd read that. And I remember she had some people that would come visit, and they brought a New York Post with them. And there was my uncle read the World Telegram and Sun and brought that when he came to visit us. So I was just reading a lot of different sports sections and getting what I thought was some very different points of view about the Jets as a team. There really wasn't much else into it because, again, I was learning about football on the go. And I was learning about the Jets at the same time. And it wasn't, as I mentioned before, for a couple of years until I got curious enough to wonder, you know, are these guys any good? You know, could they play? Because the NFL was obviously the standard. And you could watch Y.A. Tittle play, and I did. And you could watch the Giants play on the road. And you know, I would watch their games somewhat. But, you know, who knew if these Jet players were any good? It really wasn't until Namath hit the scene that everything kind of exploded because NBC wanted to put him on every single week if they could. They couldn't show his home games, but every road game, was on. And the NBC just tried to lure college players by telling them, if you sign with this league, all your games are going to be televised in color next year. And CBS wasn't doing that with the National Football League. So there was a lot of things going on simultaneously to try to capture the interest and the attention of American sports fans, to football.
Well, it seems though that the Jets' early years, the first years in Shea Stadium, were before Namath, right?
That was Matt Snell, and Matt Snell was the big star, and he had a fabulous rookie year. And I talked with him at great length in the book, and I said, Matt, you had your best year as a rookie. Why is that? And he said, look at the competition I was playing against. And he said after that, the league got better every single year, and it got tougher and tougher to excel.
Yeah, but it seems like the fans really did take to the team in those first years, right?
Well, I think part of it but I think, Tim, it was a large part of it was the stadium. Yeah. Shea Stadium was supposed to be, for its time, a great place to watch football or baseball. And the Met, look, if you look at the attendance figures for the Mets when they moved from the Polo Grounds, and I think they barely drew I don't think they even drew 1 million people. If they did, it was just over it. But when they went to Shea Stadium, the attendance exploded because it was a beautiful, clean ballpark with great sight lines and no posts and that sort of thing. And for football, Shea Stadium was pretty darn good, as a football venue. And Sonny Werblin jazzed up the ballpark. You said you went to see a Jets game. Well, Sonny Werblin put a complete band, a professional band out in left field, near the wall. And he had this little jet plane going up and down the sidelines every time the Jets scored. So he recognized that football could and should be more than just football. It should be an afternoon or an evening of entertainment.
Yeah, and it's new, it's fresh, right? And it's a destination, but that's clearly not going to last long. And you wonder, and it's probably very simplistic, right, to say, well, everything changed when Namath arrived. Well, certainly it did, right? But this is also a story, as you get into in your book, and culminate. We'll get to the end of it eventually in the actual Super Bowl number 3. This is not just Joe Namath and nothing else, right? There is a team that WeBank is building. A number of these players are there for a good portion of this run, from the decrepit former Titans and Polo Grounds into this new thing. Let's talk about Namath, right? Because there's no doubt you can avoid that, right? The fact that they were able to get him, number one, is an interesting story, right? Because they didn't have the worst record in the AFL, but they certainly weren't all that.
Well, they made a very fortuitous deal. But let me get to the point that you first made here, and that is how good the rest of the team was by 68. There were 10 other Jets who were in the AFL All-Star game the week after the Super Bowl. There were 11 all told. Namath was the 11th. And I mean, Jerry Philbin was a great defensive end. He made the all AFL all-time team, as a defensive end, and he only played 6 years. John Elliott was a right tackle. People today, Jet fans, they mix up John Elliott, who played offensive tackle in the 80s and 90s for the Jets, with this guy. John Elliott, the defensive tackle, was an absolute dynamo. And, I found it, I knew that he was really quick and that it made him really hard for, offensive linemen to block him. I had no idea exactly what that meant. And just to give you an example, Ed Buddy was a 295-pound, 6'5" offensive guard, and he played opposite John Elliott. Buddy played for Kansas City. And I talked to Buddy about playing against Elliott because he was dead when I was writing the book. And so I needed somebody who could tell me how good a player this guy was. And I said, why didn't you just run over him? You had him by 2 inches, and 50 pounds. And he said, I couldn't. And I said, what do you mean you couldn't? He said to me, I couldn't get a clean shot on him. I would try to hit him right between the numbers. And he was so quick, he'd get out of the way and I would glance off his shoulder and he'd still be there to make a play. I mean, I've never played organized football, but when you hear a guy of that size talk about this guy against him who's smaller, but just so quick that you can't get a clean shot on him, it really says quite a bit about his talent. And then on that same team at the All-Star game, you had Maynard, who went into the Hall of Fame, and George Sauer, who was probably in the top 3 wide receivers in the league at the time, and even Pete Lamons at tight end. And they had any one of their offensive linemen could have gone to the All-Star game, and I think as two of them did. They just had such a good team. In fact, Tim, one guy in the interviews I've done said to me, what's the legacy of that 68-69 Jets team? And I thought about it, and here's what I came up with. In the 60s, even though I was a Mets fan, I had to have the highest regard for the history of the Yankees. And Mickey Mantle was my favorite player. He was everybody's favorite player. But everybody in the 60s knew about the 27 Yankees, because that was considered the greatest baseball team of all time. Of course, that's the year that Ruth hit 60 and Gehrig hit 47 or 48. Ruth out-homered half the teams in the league just all by himself. And I look at the 68-69 Jets team because of the talent and because of what they were able to do that year, not just the Super Bowl, but how beautifully and how well they played the whole season as a unit, offensively and defensively. That, this is the 27 Yankees if you're a Jets fan. They've never had a team that was as loaded as that team was. And that is a real testament, to Weeb Ewbank. And we should devote a lot of time to him because Sonny Werblin spent the money to sign a lot of players. Weeb Ewbank had the more gargantuan task, and that was turning really good, talented collegiate athletes into top-notch professional football players. And that's coaching and even more coaching.
Yeah, so in your estimation then, who or maybe there's multiple who's, were responsible for, this buildup of this?
Oh, there's no doubt. It was no doubt it was Weeb Ewbank. No, there's absolutely no doubt. Because he not only was the coach, he was the general manager, and I was told he made all the draft picks. He took advice from, some of the assistant coaches, because assistant coaches in those days were the scouts. They would go out on Saturday if the Jets were playing at home, and they would scout players, on the East Coast. And if the Jets were playing on the West Coast, they would break up and they would go and watch, West Coast college teams. But Ewbank had the final say, and he made some horrible choices. But in building not only the team that he built, he used a unique philosophy. He put great emphasis on intelligence, not just on size. The Jet players told me how the Kansas City Chiefs used to run out on the field before they'd play them, and they would run on the field in order of size, the smallest guy out first, and then get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And they would just kind of run in a circle at midfield to try to intimidate the other team with their size, how big they were, how strong they were. The Jets were not a small team, but they were an average size team with great intelligence and great quickness and speed. And that was the real key to their defense, which was unusual in those days. And obviously they were loaded on offense with Namath and all the tools, that he had at his call.
And that offensive line, right, you have to devote your chapter 9 to it, the O-line, right? It protected, the subtitle, it protected Namath at all costs, right? So yes. We all know what the crown jewels were, right? But that offensive line probably more than earned its fair share, I guess, or should have its accolades, right? Because they knew they were protecting, quote unquote, the franchise.
Joe Namath got sacked less than any quarterback in pro football from like 65 when he first got there until like 72, 73, 74. I mean, it's not even close. He got sacked in 1967 9 times the whole year. And for 7 or 8 of those games, they had no running backs because Snell got hurt and Boozer got hurt. And so he'd throw on, 2 of the 3 downs every time they had the ball. The other team knew they were going to throw. And Namath didn't like to throw screen passes and short stuff. He liked to go for the bomb or, as I mentioned in the book, a down and out. I'm not an organized football player, but, we've all played on the Sandlot, and a down and out, simple play like that. A normal professional down and out is like 10 yards. George Sauer would run 20 yards downfield, make a fake, and then cut to the sidelines, turn around, and the ball would be right there in his chest. Namath was throwing the ball 35, 40 yards on a simple down and out that other quarterbacks were throwing 10, 15 yards.
So before we go further, though, I want to talk about Namath specifically because, and you mentioned Eubank and his genius in this, but I think people forget that when Namath was secured via the draft or the shenanigans that
they made a trade to get the first pick in the AFL draft,
but even then, right, and all the excitement, right, the Broadway Joe or the Playboy sort of lifestyle and stuff, an immediate sensation, but Weeb was not necessarily certain that Namath was ready to be a success, let alone kind of be thrown in there with the Lions, right? He had like 2 or 3, maybe even 4 other quarterbacks, including, I believe, a Heisman Trophy winner, John Huarte.
Well, they drafted John Ewart in the second round. And John Ewart went to the college all-star game, which they used to play in those days. Sonny Werblin didn't want to send any of his high-priced, young talent that he had just signed to the all-star game. And he was ordered by the league, by the American Football League, that he had to release, I think, 3 or 4 of them and let them go to the game. So John Ewart went to the college all-star game, and he had the game of his life against the Cleveland Browns, I guess it would have been at 65. And he was voted the most valuable player in the game. And he had a great game, a lot of yards, a couple of touchdowns, just really did beautifully, and came back to camp. And he was a good player, and it turned out he was a workmanlike player. He existed in the league for 10 or 11 years, got himself a nice pension, but he was nothing more than a backup quarterback who rarely played for the teams that he ended up with after the Jets released him his rookie year. They traded him to Boston. Namath, he didn't really have a lot of competition. In fact, one of the interesting things to me is in my conversations with Ewart, this is not in the book, I said to John, you signed with them after Namath signed with the Jets. Why did you go to the Jets? Well, I had a better offer than the Eagles gave me. I said, did Sonny Werblin or Weeb Eubank say that you'd have a shot to win the number 1 quarterback job? And he said, no. I said, so why would you go there if they put all this money in Namath and they paid him twice as much as they paid John Ewart? And everything was public pretty much back then because Werblin wanted everybody to know how much these humongous salaries he was paying his rookie players. And I actually asked John Ewart, you're a Heisman Trophy winner who'd played at Notre Dame and had won accolades. It doesn't sound like you were all that competitive, that you had a fire in your belly to fight to be the number 1 quarterback. And he just kind of chuckled and said, well, I wanted to play, but I wasn't going to make a big deal about it. Today you got these guys sitting on the bench and they're fighting, to get into any kind of a game, no matter what professional sport we're talking about. John Ewart didn't have that. Namath didn't start until the 3rd or 4th game of his first season. They had a quarterback named Mike Tolliver who had been there for the year before. He was from Illinois, and he had a great arm, but his arm didn't really work that well because he couldn't hit his receivers. He just, flung the ball as hard as he could, and really it didn't have a lot of connections. So he almost won the job by default, meaning Namath. Werblin wanted him to start. The fans wanted Namath to start. Everybody wanted to see Broadway Joe play. And it really wasn't until Tolliver showed that he wasn't up to it that they finally put Namath in the lineup and let him play. And he ended up being the Rookie of the Year. He doesn't have the greatest statistics, for that year, but he was such a talent and he drew so much attention and everybody wanted to see him play that, he was an obvious choice for that honor.
Yeah, I mean, so how much of those early days was just his persona and how much of it was his talent, right? Because it's very interesting to hear you've got two very arguably quality college, quarterback arms that are in the mix, or at least in the background and or, under which I guess Eubank was sort of saying, maybe Namath can kind of learn and sort of ease his way into it. But I guess it seems to me there's a little bit more of the pizzazz and the storyline of Namath, kind of maybe pushing it a little earlier than maybe Eubank would have wanted in the first place.
Well, Eubank, but here's something that you should remember, Tim. Back then, the rule of thumb was a rookie quarterback would stand on the sidelines for 4 years and hold a clipboard until they thought he was ready to play. Namath kind of broke all that rules. In fact, he wasn't the only guy because the American Football League needed good young quarterback talent. They had George Blanda, who was already in his mid-30s, and Tobin Rote, who played in the NFL for 12 years, and Babe Parilli, who had bounced all around. They needed these young quarterbacks to really establish themselves. So Namath got that opportunity, but you also have to remember that Sonny Werblin was a master PR guy. And he did everything he could to mold Namath not only into a star on the field, but a star off the field. And he was a celebrity in his time. Namath would go to nightclubs and he'd have Raquel Welch on his arm, or he went to Barbra Streisand a couple of times, on dates after she did Funny Girl. And he was all the time being photographed, because Werblin would tell the press where he was going to be. So that was kind of the legend of Broadway Joe being built, in the New York Post and the Daily News every day. And he also became a sex symbol. A lot of fans who came out to Shea Stadium were women. And it was really the first time that women started to pay any attention to professional football. So he got that, in his credit as well. If you look at his numbers, even for his career, he doesn't knock you out. In fact, one of my nephews, when he heard about the book I was going to write, he actually went and he looked at the numbers from Super Bowl III. And he said, Namath he didn't have a great game statistically that day. He didn't have the kind of game that Terry Bradshaw did, or Troy Aikman did, or Tom Brady has had, and that sort of thing. And I said to him, but that wasn't his job that day. His job was to control the Colts defense and keep them on the field and not let the Colts offense get on the field. So he wasn't gunslinging that day. And it was one of the few times in his career that he didn't gunsling, and it was probably one of the reasons why it was his finest professional performance.
I think it's also interesting too that here's Namath, sort of the original or the 60s version of the Playboy, right, and burning the proverbial candle at both ends. Didn't seem to affect him on the field, really, right? He only seemed to get better and better. 67, right? He's throwing over 4,000 yards, right? Which is a record.
Well, in that year he threw for 12,000 yards because they had no running game, and he was throwing on almost every down. But you make a great point, because he had a ritual on Saturday night before a game. It went something like this. He wanted a blonde and 2 Johnny Walker Reds, and he was set for the evening.
We should all be so lucky that would be the impetus to be successful in life.
And he said, he did a Playboy interview after they won the Super Bowl, and in it he talked about the fact that the Jets trainers had told him they had no problem with him having sex the night before a game. But in those days they used to say you don't have sex before a big game in any sport because it robs the energy out of your legs. And Namath not only didn't care about that, he claimed the trainer told him, hey, if it relaxes you, go ahead and do it. In fact, he had one of his worst games that 68 season where they played Buffalo. And they went up to Buffalo, and I guess he was a good boy the night before. And he threw 5 interceptions, and 3 of them were run back for touchdowns. And Dave Herman, who played offensive guard for them, told Namath in the locker room, if you ever come in here and you haven't gotten laid and drunk the night before a game, I'm going to put this alcohol right down your throat.
Now that's taking one for the team now, isn't it? That's real team loyalty.
That's being a team player.
So, all right. So let's a couple of things along the way here, right? So a couple of very important events sort of during this period of time leading up to this game, and we'll get to it. The NFL and the AFL announcing effectively in '66, right, that a merger was eventually going to happen circa, 1970 or so. Yeah,
they had to wait till 70 because that's when the TV contracts would expire.
Yeah, so how much did that kind of change the dynamic in both the AFL, the games, the Jets, its perception in New York, for example, versus the Giants? I mean, it was an instant credibility, this merger announcement, but it certainly set the tone for what arguably should be a somewhat of an equilibrium, right?
The only equilibrium that I thought existed was that if you pick up the New York Times from those days and you pick up the Sunday morning newspaper, that there would be a headline at the top that would say something like, Giants play the Eagles today and the Jets host the Patriots. So they were getting equal billing on the top headline. I don't think that the Jets were really treated all that respectfully. I know they weren't by the players. The Jet players to a man complained to me about they'd make personal appearance and get a third of the money that a Giant player got for making the same appearance. And the Giants, Giant owners, they wouldn't let Marty Glickman, who was broadcasting the Giant games, give a Jet score, even after the merger announcement. They just wouldn't let him do it. It's like they didn't exist. So I don't think that really came to pass. But you bring up an interesting thing about the merger. Sonny Werblin and Al Davis, who was running the Oakland Raiders at that point in '66, they did not want a merger. And they didn't want a merger primarily, among other things, because the Jets and the 49, Jets and the Raiders, and some of the other AFL teams as well, were going to have to pay an indemnity to the New York Giants and to the San Francisco 49ers because the Jets and Oakland had, quote unquote, invaded these existing NFL territories. And Eubank and Davis both told the other AFL owners when it came time to vote, don't vote for a merger now. In a year, the NFL will be paying us to merge. Because when we take players away from them, which the AFL did, Davis signed John Brody for the AFL. He signed Roman Gabriel. He signed Mike Ditka. And there were others ready to go to the American Football League and got big contracts, much bigger than they'd been paid in the NFL. And that's when the merger really, got pushed right up to the front burner because already the NFL owners had realized that Namath's signing had caused all the teams in the AFL and some of the teams in the NFL to pay what were considered outrageous rookie salaries. And it completely wiped out the NFL salary structure. They were giving the best rookie talent, like Bob Lilly of the Cowboys. I was told he got $12,000 and a small bonus to sign with the Cowboys. And he was about as fine a defensive lineman as there was, in college football at that time. Even Gale Sayers, I can tell you, he only signed for $25,000 with the Chicago Bears. The Jets were ready to try to sign him for much more, but Kansas City wouldn't trade his rights to them. The Jets wanted to sign Dick Butkus, and they gave him a blank check. Said, whatever you want, we'll give you whatever you want. This is months before they signed Joe Namath. But George Halas had already gotten a verbal understanding with Butkus that he would play for the Bears. And by the way, for years afterwards, Butkus rued the fact that he had turned down the Jets and gone to play for the Bears. So the structure of salaries in the National Football League had been completely destroyed. And that was step one to force the NFL owners to try to get a merger. And then when Al Davis started stealing some of the NFL's best talent, well, that was it. That got the merger rolling right away. But even then, Werblin and Davis didn't want to have a merger. They wanted to hold off and really hold the NFL's feet to the fire.
So Werblin's an interesting character in all of this too, right? Because he was part of the syndicate, or maybe the ringleader, I guess, of the syndicate. That
he was, people think he was. I don't think he was, but he was certainly part of the syndicate, and he was willing to be the front man.
Right. Well, but there's no doubt he was instrumental or a part of the process of getting the team from Harry Wismer back when they were the Titans and bringing the Jets in their new incarnation into life. Obviously, his knowledge of media and his attraction to a big star and pumping up that star in Joe Namath. But what I find interesting as the team is getting incrementally better and Namath, showing his arm at a then record pace in 67. I think it's probably important to kind of dwell a little bit on the person that is Sonny Werblin in all this, because in 68, right? And again, in retrospect, this is an interesting time given what happens later in the season and or the early part of the next year. Werblin basically is kind of forced out of the organization altogether at the beginning of 68, isn't he?
Yeah, he wasn't he was forced out. The other owners, and particularly the owners' wives, were very upset that the Jets would have press conferences and dinners and this sort of thing, and they would relegate the other owners to the back of the room. They thought they should be sitting in the front of the room with Werblin and his wife and Weeb and his wife and et cetera. And hey, I can't argue, against that point. And so it came to a head, and either Werblin was going to buy them out or they were going to buy him out. And he couldn't come up with the cash to buy the other guys out. He wanted to, but if he paid the $6 million price tag that an accountant had set for the value of the team, we would have had to Sonny would have to have hocked everything that he owned, all his homes and everything else. And, he just wouldn't have had any more money. So he had to sell out to them. And that to me is one of the sadder parts of the story, because, yeah, he was there during the Super Bowl. He lived down in Southern Florida, had a place there, and was at the game and hosted the Jet players the night before and after they won the Super Bowl. But, he wasn't in the middle of it the way he could have been and should have been, having really built the team and made all the decisions, money and otherwise.
Do I have this right and I wonder how much he was involved in this, and even if it's true, that prior to the 68 season, Ubek was even necessarily guaranteed to last in his role as coach, right? Even though they were improving, there was discussion that maybe he would be tossed. Do I have this right that Vince Lombardi was on their radar, or maybe Sonny's?
They talked to Lombardi. Lombardi had just retired from Green Bay, I think the year before. He retired after the second Super Bowl, and he was the general manager of the Packers. And Lombardi wasn't going to take the job, probably for two reasons, and one of them was he was an NFL guy, and he felt, I'm sure, that he would have been stabbing the Mara family in the back by going the coach, on the other side of town. So that didn't come to pass. And then, ironically, the very next year, after the Jets won the Super Bowl, he went to Washington and had his 1 year with the Redskins.
Yeah, that's interesting, because you wonder what would have happened if that all changed and stuff too. And again, this is really interesting in hindsight, because 1968, such a pivotal season, or these seasons.
Yeah.
For Jets,
and there's such a big,
before it started.
And Tim, there's such a huge difference in attitude and philosophy and in, I'll say, behavior between Eubank, who basically didn't like to find players, didn't scream or yell. He saw himself as a teacher, and he was a hell of a teacher. He could coach anybody on the field, just about. And a Lombardi, who Jerry Kramer famously said he treats us all the same, like dogs. I mean, he was a real taskmaster. And you have to wonder how Namath, would have done under Lombardi. I happen to think he would have done very well, because Sonny Jurgensen wasn't much different, as a personality and as a guy who liked good times outside off the field. And he immediately fell in love with Lombardi when he went to Washington.
All right, time for me to catch my breath, get a cool, tasty beverage, and remind you, while we do so, that our friends at Audible are here to remind you that you can get a free audiobook download of your choice from over 180,000 titles. If you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats and use that link, of course, to try for yourself a free audiobook on us, gratis, if you will. And you will love the idea of audiobooks. It's an awesome way to kill time and occupy and stimulate your mind, perhaps when your eyes are busy doing something else. And of course, there are plenty of interesting books to be found, especially in the world of sports and sports history. And I think our audience might enjoy a few of these, of course, including the seminal work by baseball legend Jim Bouton. It's called Ball 4. It is not only written, but it's also narrated by him. You could use your free credit for that book. And of course, as you know, Ball 4 centers around the 1969 one-year wonder that is the Seattle Pilots of Major League Baseball, but obviously the background for a whole lot of other observations about the sport of baseball. And it remains to this day perhaps one of the most celebrated writings about the sport of baseball in this country. Of course, you can also, if you're not a big baseball fan, you can go into the world of soccer with the autobiography called My Turn by Johan Cruyff, the late Johan Cruyff, perhaps one of the world's best ever soccer players. He of Dutch heritage, of course. Plenty of great legendary years at club play as well as national team play for the Dutch team, as well as, for our audience, maybe a little bit of interest, his journeys in the North American Soccer League in the late 70s and early 80s with the Washington Diplomats and the Los Angeles Aztecs. And of course, if you're into football, there's probably no better book, especially if you find yourself really interested in the sort of deep and rich history of the NFL, with the book called NFL Football, A History of America's New National Pastime. It is written by Richard Crepeau and narrated by Marlon May. That, too, is an audiobook that you could choose from over, like I said, 180,000 titles. There's got to be something in there that's going to be of interest to you. And by all means, give it a try. And we appreciate your doing so at audibletrial.com/goodseats. And again, you're going to get your free audiobook download. You can cancel at any time. And again, even if you cancel it, you can keep that book as long as your device exists. So again, we appreciate it. Give it a try. audibletrial.com/goodseats. And now back to our conversation. So let's talk about this 1968 season, right? Because it's obviously crucial and pivotal and an amazing story in its own right. But it starts off, from what I understand, not unlike most of the other seasons that the Jets had at Shea Stadium, on the road, right? It feels to me like the Jets were the second team in Shea Stadium behind the Mets in terms of.
They always were, but that year was not entirely like that, although the first two games were played on the road. They played at Kansas City, and then they played the Boston Patriots in Birmingham. And then they got to play a home game against against San Diego. And then they went on the road. I'm sorry, the third game was in Buffalo. They played the first three games on the road. You're absolutely right. They didn't have the right to play on the field until the Mets were eliminated. And the Mets got eliminated fairly early in '68. They finished ninth, the only time in their first couple of years they didn't finish last. And so they got to play the fourth game at home against San Diego, and the fifth game at home against Denver. But yeah, they played a heavy road schedule, and they did great in the first game against Kansas City, and they did fine against Boston. And Patriots were not very good in the second game. And in the third game, they went to Buffalo, and Namath had his 5-interception game. The Jets, there's no reason the Jets should have lost that game, but they found a way to lose, and that was to have, three interceptions run back for touchdowns. And then they went home to San Diego, and they beat them on a Saturday night. And then Denver came in, and Denver had 21 rookies. And they beat the Jets again because Namath threw another 5 interceptions. And that was a turning point in the season, because they kind of put Namath under wraps after that, and they had him follow the game plan strictly, which he did anyway all the time. And they emphasized their running game, their kicking game, and their defense. and they won the next 3 or 4 games in a row at Shea, using those strengths, of the team. So I say in the book that Namath had 4 different seasons that year. He had the first game against Kansas City where he was superb, and he threw 2 long touchdown passes, and he made an incredibly clutch third down throw with like 5 minutes left in the game that kept the ball in the Jets' possession, and they ran out the clock, won by 1 point. And Kansas City had Jan Stenerud, one of the greatest kickers of all time, who could hit 50-yard field goals. He was one of the first soccer-style kickers. He could hit 50-yard field goals, no problem at all. And if they'd gotten the ball, they probably would have, gotten a field goal from him, and they would have beaten the Jets. But the Jets didn't give up the ball the last 5-6 minutes, thanks to Namath. So that was his first kind of incarnation that year. And then you have him, with the 5 interception games. And the second one finally gets him to realize that he's taking unnecessary risks with his throws. And so I describe it, they put him in a cocoon. And they said, hand the ball to Snell, hand the ball to Boozer, hand the ball to Mathis, throw a couple of screen passes, throw some short passes to Sauer and to Maynard and to Lamons, and let's just take it real simple. And he did that. And then they played Oakland on the road in the famous Heidi game. And they let him loose. And that week and the next week against San Diego, he had his 2 best games of the season. He threw for each one well over 300 yards and 3 touchdowns and no interceptions, and just was an absolute marvel to watch. And then they played the last 3-4 games at home, and they had Perilli play quite a bit because he hadn't had a chance to play. And then comes the playoffs. He has the big championship game, against Oakland, and of course the Super Bowl game. So he had really an up and down type season, and yet he was voted the Pro Football Player of the Year at the end of the season, even though I think he had 15 touchdowns and 17 interceptions.
All right, let's talk about the Raiders that season, right? Because it's sort of a tale of 2 games, right? That the aforementioned Heidi game, which, for you young whippersnappers out there, right, you could look it up. You want to kind of give us a thumbnail of sort of what was going on and how that game became the Heidi game? Because
well, first of all, there's a huge rivalry between the Jets and Oakland because Weeb Eubank had very little use for Al Davis. Early on in the Jets' history, the 2 teams made a trade, and Weeb traded Daynard Paulson, who was a pretty good defensive back, a good safety, to Oakland for an offensive guard, and his name escapes me now. And Al Davis forgot to tell Weeb that the offensive guard was committed and had to serve in the National Guard for like the first 5, 6, 7 games of the season, and Weeb did not like that. There was also really bad blood because Walt Michaels, who was the Jets' defensive coordinator in the Super Bowl season, had started his coaching career with Oakland in 1962, and he had been let go after 1 season and rather unceremoniously let go. He'd been treated rather shabbily when they told him that he was not coming back. And so he had really a tremendous amount of anger at the Oakland franchise. And both Weeb and Michaels let that dislike filter right down to the players. And the Jets didn't have a lot of success playing in Oakland in their early years. In fact, famously, the year before the Heidi game, they had, I think, played Oakland the next to last game of the season. And Namath had his jaw broken by the Raiders. They'd literally just smashed his helmet off his head and broken his jaw. And that picture of him being hit like that and basically being driven to the ground had been blown up and was put up in the Oakland offices in giant size for everybody to see. So there was very bad blood between the two teams. So the Jets go to Oakland. They have the best team in the East of the AFL, and it's pretty clear they're going to win the AFL East. In fact, they did the next week when they beat San Diego. And it's a back and forth game between Namath, who's having a great game, and Darryl Lamonica, who's having a great game. But a couple of odd things happened. The Jets got incredibly penalized that game. In the first half, John Elliott had been cheap-shotted by Jim Otto, the Oakland center, and when he retaliated, they threw him out of the game. And he went berserk because he said, hey, I'm just responding to what this guy did to me. Well, of course, they didn't have replay in those days, and nobody could see what had actually happened. But Elliott was thrown out of the game. And the Jets got called for 5 or 6 grabbing the helmet penalties that game. And the Jets didn't do things like that. And so they were very frustrated by that. And then in the second half, Jim Hudson, who was their starting safety, and he was one of the AFL All-Stars I referred to earlier, he got thrown out of the game. They said that he had yanked the helmet of one of the Oakland running backs, and it was pretty clear he had not. But he got thrown out of the game, and as he left the field, he gave the half a peace sign to the official, which earned him a fine on top of that. So the Jets, it's a back and forth game, and the Jets go ahead 32-29 on a Jim Turner field goal with 1 minute and 3 seconds left in the game. And at that point, NBC breaks and goes to the Heidi movie. And so no one except on the West Coast gets to see the last minute of the game. And in the last minute of the game, Darryl Lamonica picked on the substitute for Jim Hudson. His name was Mike D'Amato. And he sent out a running back with pretty good speed, Charlie Smith, who beat him, on a pass play. And it put Oakland ahead. So now the score was the Jets had 32, and Oakland had 36 to 32. And Oakland kicks off, and Earl Christie, the Jets returner, drops the ball and goes back to pick it up. And as he goes to pick it up, Mark Smolinski, who was on the Jets special teams, accidentally knocks into Christie and knocks the ball loose. And it tumbles into the end zone, and the Raiders cover it in the end zone. And they kick the extra point, and now it's 43-32, and the game is over. But 3/4 of the country hadn't seen the last minute. And Mrs. Weeb Eubank calls Weeb after the game and congratulates him on the victory. And Weeb said, "What are you talking about? We lost." The next day, what had happened, including the Heidi, switcheroo, was on page 1 of the New York Times. And the New York Times, a very serious newspaper in those days, and they didn't put sports on the first page, but they did that day.
Yeah, and it's the follow through of all of that is the reason why we see overages now when games continue to go into overtime, et cetera.
Yeah, after that, both of the networks, CBS and NBC, told their respective leagues that they would not switch away from a game until it was finished from there on.
Well, besides that sort of major spectacle / media debacle, right? How much of because the Jets, only lost 3 games that season, right? And to Oakland being one of them. How much was that impetus and or incentive when they were to meet in the AFL Championship in December, and this time at home at Shea? Was there bad blood and or a special sort of, peak, I guess, in the Jets locker room? Or is it just
the Jets players told me, again, almost to a man, we wanted the Raiders. The Raiders had to play Kansas City in a playoff game because they had both finished the regular season 12-2, I believe it was. And so they had a playoff game, and Oakland crushed Kansas City. And the Jets wanted to play Oakland again. And they wanted to play him in New York. They'd actually beaten them at Shea the year before. It's the only loss that the Raiders had on their way to the Super Bowl. And the Jets figured, the defensive players figured, that the cold weather was going to be something that Oakland was not accustomed to. And it was a frigidly cold day that day, December 29th, 1968. And very windy, because Shea was always extremely windy with gusts going in all kinds of directions. And just when you would think you'd figured out those gusts, they would change and swirl and things like that. So the Jets wanted Oakland they wanted to get to get even, but the Jets also felt that they could play them even better at Shea because the Raiders were not used to the conditions. And Shea Stadium for a football game for the players was not an ideal place to play, particularly once the weather got bad, because the good part of the field was still not grass covered. They let the baseball field stay out there, except they dropped the mound, the pitcher's mound, to a reasonable height. And there was a peculiar little thing in the end zone, I was told, in the right end zone behind home plate at Shea Stadium. It was, I can't remember exactly what the specifications were, but it was several feet lower in the right corner of the end zone than the rest of the end zone. And the Jet players knew that, and the receivers knew that, and they could make adjustments, and so could Namath. But if you were the quarterback on the other team, even if you knew about it, it's very hard to make an adjustment just for that one game. You come out on the field before the game, and the kickers and the quarterbacks have maybe 15 minutes to throw the ball around or kick the ball around and try to get used to the conditions. So the Jets thought they had an advantage there. Again, nip and tuck game. Oakland takes their only lead of the game with, I guess it's 8 minutes left in the fourth quarter. And Don Maynard goes to Namath and reminds him what he had told Namath early in the game, and that is he knew that he could get a step or two on George Atkinson, who was the rookie defensive back that was covering Maynard. And he said, "You just let me know. I can get a step on him, and we can go for the bomb whenever you want to." And on the second play from scrimmage, after the Jets had fallen behind, Namath calls that play. And what's remarkable about the play is how far Namath had to throw the ball, and against a wind. He was throwing from the the open end of Shea Stadium from about the 30-yard line near the left hash mark. And he ended up throwing the ball to the 10-yard line on the right sideline down the field. And Dave Anderson of the New York Times told me that the throw had to have gone at least 70 or 75 yards in the air. Remarkable. And Don Maynard called that catch over his right shoulder. The ball was aimed for his left shoulder, but the wind took it over his right shoulder. He said it was the greatest and the most important catch he ever made. On the very next play, Maynard caught a touchdown pass that Namath threw from the 7 or 8 yard line, and those were the winning points of the game.
And arguably one of the seminal moments in his eventual Hall of Fame career, Maynard. Namath too, for that matter. I mean, look, I'm sure it became pretty common for sort of that electricity and Namath to kind of make things happen. Maynard or otherwise. I wonder, having not been there, what the feeling was besides, elation at winning the AFL championship and righting the wrong, I guess, of losing that game late to Oakland, a couple of months earlier. I'm wondering how much, the locker room and the management kind of thought, well, okay, AFL championship, it's great. We've really sort of climbed the mountain over these last 6, 7, 8 years as a franchise. And then, 2 weeks later, we're kind of going off to the slaughter, right? To go meet these Colts that just demolished the Cleveland Browns earlier or later in the day in the NFL side. Or was the beginnings of sort of, we can maybe win this whole thing kind of starting to circulate? Were you able to discern any of that sort of feeling in the, after that game? And
I got to tell you, the players were just so enthusiastic having beaten Oakland, finally, in a game that really mattered, that I don't think most of them even thought about the Super Bowl. True professionals, a number of them said to me, hey, you have to win the AFL championship game before you even can get to the Super Bowl, so one game at a time. And I think that was their attitude. The fascinating thing to me about what happened next is that while the rest of the football world was being told by the media that the Jets had no chance, that the Jets watched the film of the Colts and they thought that Oakland was a better team than the Baltimore Colts were. And they cited things to me, which are in the book, about why they felt that way and how they felt they could attack the Colts and how vulnerable the Colts were to certain things. And that's what played out in the game. The veteran players in particular, they told me they had no fear of the Colts. Walt Michaels told me that he told the players in the locker room, hey, I played in the National Football League for 12 years. They put on their pant legs one at a time, just like we do. And our coaches have come from the same places that their coaches have. And you with the players have come from the same colleges that they've had. Now, unless you don't believe that we're really good coaches or that we've got a lot of talent on this team, there's no way in the world you should worry about having to play the Baltimore Colts. And the veteran players, just about every one of them said, no problem at all. In fact, I think the best remark came from Don Maynard. And it's on the back cover of the book. And Don Maynard told me he had no fear about playing Baltimore, and I asked him why. I said, Green Bay had killed Kansas City and then destroyed Oakland. And he said, I wasn't scared of Baltimore because Vince Lombardi was not going to be coaching the Colts.
Interesting. Very interesting. Well, yeah, it's also, too, the Colts, were having their issues, too, right? Johnny U was not sort of kind of his Hall of Fame career top of game either. And Earl Morrall was,
And Unitas was hurt that year. Yeah. And, clearly, you could see it in the Super Bowl. He just couldn't really throw the ball that well. He was throwing a lot of really dovetail, pop-ups. But they had so thoroughly outclassed the National Football League using the tactics that they did. And ironically, a lot of those tactics were something that the Jets were not only accustomed to in the AFL, things like, all-out blitzes and basically playing zone defense against Namath, which for the most part was playing with a stick of dynamite because his receivers were so good and they were so in tune with working with Namath on every kind of pass pattern and in every kind of situation that, it was almost silly to play zone defense against them. You had to try to stop the receivers. And in those days, you got to remember, Tim, they had what they call bump and run. And you could not only bump the guy at the line of scrimmage, you could bump him all the way downfield until the ball was in the air. Then it was interference. But you could knock the crap out of him. Much tougher to be a wide receiver in those days and to have a quarterback, hit the wide receiver. You had to be fast and elusive and have, which is what Maynard was, or have just unbelievable moves like George Sauer Jr., who could just fake guys, out of their underdrawers. So the other thing that's really fascinating, and you have to look at it in retrospect, Bobby Boyd was playing against Don Maynard. In fact, I talked to Maynard. I met him for the first time about a month ago. I interviewed him for the book over the phone. And I said, did you know that Bobby Boyd's timing in the 40-yard dash was 5 seconds? I mean, that's something like you or I would run, Tim. And he was considered one of the best defensive backs in the National Football League, and the Colts had not allowed a long touchdown the entire year. And Maynard said to me, hey, I didn't know how fast this guy or slow this guy was. I just looked at the film and I knew I could outrun this guy. I can get past this guy simple. And he did a couple of times. And even though he never caught a pass in that game, he scared the Willikers out of the Colts and forced them to double team him the entire game from like the middle of the first quarter on. And that's why George Sauer had such a huge game on the other side against Lenny Lyles, because he was going one-on-one.
All right, 2 more questions, and this is just, it's just, again, very interesting, and I can see some of the video clips playing in my head right now.
Yeah.
But give us a sense of, and I'm just curious, maybe some of the other players that you talked to in writing this book, about what was going on those 2 weeks before. This is the time when there was, there were 2 weeks before the beginning of the Super Bowl, right? So there was a whole bunch of, play up and press and all that kind of stuff. Namath seemed to be pretty much like a loose cannon, right? He was kind of going all over the place, not only, touting a victory and stuff, but he was going at it. He was, knocking Earl Morrall as being maybe the 3rd best if he was on the Jets, and
the 5th best.
The fifth best. Okay, there
So
you
he's
go.
the fifth best he would have been the fifth best in the AFL.
And he apparently got in some kind of altercation or verbal kind of conflict with the Colts kicker in a restaurant down in Miami. I mean, what was going on with? Is this just Namath trying to psych everybody out, or is he just nuts, or what? And where are the other players in all of this? Are they kind of like just kind of keeping their mouths shut, or do they similarly have the same kind of braggadocio that Namath did?
Everybody was supposed to be under wraps. Eubank came into the first meeting with the players after he had spent days with the other assistants watching film of the Colts, and he told the Jets, if we can't pass against this team, we ought to just quit being football players. That's how confident he was. But he said the key thing here is we have to keep our mouths shut because the Colts don't respect us. And I talked to some of the players, Tim, on the Colts, and they didn't. They had so much overconfidence that they were going to walk out on the field and destroy the Jets. It was palpable. The Jets told me that they would turn on the TV at night and watch the local sports in Miami, and you'd hear the Colts. They didn't even know a name of a player on the Jets other than Namath. Larry Grantham, in particular, told me, I'm sitting there and they don't even know who I am. They don't know who we are on defense. They don't know any of our guys. There's no compliment. Oh, the Jets are a pretty good team. They have good pass rush and their linebackers are pretty good, but not a name. Not like you would expect to hear if you're a player who's got a lot of pride. Namath was Namath. The morning after he popped off about how the Jets were going to win and made his guarantee, several of the players, all the players came down to have breakfast. And one of the veteran players, Paul Rochester, said to me, I wasn't really that surprised. I figured two things. Number one, Joe had had too much to drink again, and Joe was being Joe. And Larry Grantham said to me, some euphemism, from the South about, you don't get a cat angry at you, and, especially if he's got long nails and that sort of thing. He said, but, it was Joe, and we know that Joe didn't mean any harm. I don't think Larry was being entirely honest with me, but that's what he said to me. But the young players, ironically, Namath had made not a prediction, but he had said that the Jets were going to win the game. The first week that the Jets were in Florida, he was famously on a chaise lounge, where there's been a picture that's been widely, distributed for years.
Iconic.
And he said there to the media all around him, of course we're going to win this game. I didn't come here to lose. Well, but that's a professional attitude, Tim. If you're a big-time college football player, much less a big-time professional player, you don't say I'm going to lose or that we'll see what happens. You talk up, hey, we're going to win. I expect to win. I'm not here to lose. I'm here to win. So he kind of set the marker down right there. And then a week and a half later, he put it out there really for everybody to see and hear. And even then, it didn't get played up that much. It was in one newspaper in Miami the next morning. None of the New York papers had the story about him and his guarantee, even though Dave Anderson from the New York Times had been there. And he told me, I didn't even report it back to the Times because I'd heard Joe say several times over a week and a half, we're going to win. So I didn't think he said anything that was really any different from what he'd been saying for 2 weeks. So Namath, from the perspective of the young players, had a greater impact with his guarantee because young players had no idea what to expect. The Jets had 8 or 9 rookies that year on the team, or guys with very limited experience. He might have been drafted before but not really played very much. And when they heard Namath say, we're going to win, they said, wow, maybe we are going to win because Joe says so. Why would Joe say this if he didn't believe it? And so that was the impact he had on the team.
Well, you made some allusions to, the impact of this game. Maybe we can just sort of circle back on that.
Yeah.
Sort of segue around third base here on this long ride home here. So to completely mix metaphors and sports. The immediate impact and the long-term impact of this victory, right? We kind of hinted at some of this, right? New York, the sports world, the Jets as a football team in New York, as well as the equivalents, perhaps, or the, casting aside of doubts about the AFL's capability of playing in the newly merged NFL. Give us some of the impacts that you sort of saw from this team, both near term and longer term.
Well, let me give you the immediate aftermath. The Jets didn't have any champagne for their locker room. The Jets owners didn't think they were going to win the game. They went into the Baltimore locker room and took the champagne from the Colts. New York did not have a ticker tape parade for the Jets. They had a welcome at Gracie Mansion for about, I think there were a dozen of them there. Namath was there. Matt Snell was there. They gave, Namath like a key to the city and the other players as well. So rather understated, to say the least. And so that was an immediate thing. Now, more importantly, and this is the thing that I think a lot of young fans today just don't understand, because it's history and it's hard for somebody who wasn't around 50 years ago, no matter how big a football fan you are, to know what happened. But let me give you a couple of the highlights. The NFL had planned, assuming that the Jets were going to get slaughtered also, as in the first two games. They were going to basically integrate the AFL teams into the National Football League structure. And by that, I mean the Jets were going into the Giants division. The Raiders were going to go into the San Francisco 49ers division. The Houston Oilers were going to go into the same division as the Dallas Cowboys, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. After the game, the AFL owners kind of got their backs up, and they told the NFL, we want to maintain our structure. We want to keep the 10 teams that we have, and we want to stay together as a 10-team structure. And after scheduling was looked at very carefully, because the AFL owners really now were looking forward to NFL teams coming to AFL cities to play against, the local team. And it was going to mean really big paydays, a lot of attendance that some of these teams were not accustomed to. And so I don't know if the fans realize it or not, but the Baltimore Colts went into what became the American Football Conference. They got paid $3 million to make the switch. And they made the switch because the Colts realized that they had built quite a rivalry now with the Jets. And they said, we'll make the move and take the money if we're in the Jets division. No problem. The Cleveland Browns moved to the American Football Conference. Second time that they had actually made a move. They were in the All-American Football League in the late 40s, and they were one of three teams that moved from the AAFC into the NFL in 1950. And now, 20 years later, they made another move from the NFL into the American Football Conference. And the Pittsburgh Steelers were the third team that took the $3 million and went to the AFC. And they did it because their big rival was Cleveland, and they wanted to be in the same division as Cleveland. And the big winner out of all of that was Pittsburgh, because they went on in the 1970s to be the most dominant team, in the NFL anywhere. There was a couple of other things that the Jet players told me, and it's really hard to put your finger on it and say this definitely would have happened. But Jerry Philbin and Bob Talamini, two of the really veteran players on the Jets, told me that in the 2 weeks before the Super Bowl, the rumor that was running around the locker room was that the NFL, if the Jets got slaughtered, the NFL was not going to take all 10 of the AFL teams. They wanted to eliminate, ideally, two of the really financially strapped teams from the AFL. Well, the two most financially strapped teams in 1969 were the Boston Patriots and the Denver Broncos. So imagine how NFL history would have changed if those two franchises had been dissolved, if they had paid off those owners to go away and those teams had not moved into the NFL. Where would Tom Brady be today? And where would John Elway have played his football all those years if there was no Denver franchise? Just a fascinating thing to conjure up. Salaries went up pretty significantly after that game because CBS wanted to retain its contract with the NFL, and they did. NBC was determined to keep its contract with the AFL. And for years, 3 or 4 years, Pete Rozelle had been trying to get one of the national TV networks to have a Monday Night Football game. And famously, he had gone to CBS, and Bill Paley, who was running CBS, said to him, let me get this straight. You want me to take Lucille Ball off the air Monday night so you can put a football game on? There's no way I'm going to do that. Well, after the Super Bowl, ABC really was intent. They were going to get into the football business. And so they agreed to pay and become Monday Night Football. And that's how Monday Night Football came to pass, because of Super Bowl III. And those are just some of the things that took place because the Jets pulled the greatest upset in Super Bowl history.
All right, last question. Give me a sense of, that's amazing, and it's a very interesting pivot in history of the sport, right? Of the people that you talk to, give me some flavor of some of the more, shall we say, unsung heroes, maybe, of this team, and maybe not just that year, but maybe some of the players that have been there for some time, toiling away in the shadow of Joe Namath.
I'm going to answer that question in 2 different ways. The very first phone call that I made, and by the way, I was kind of naive. I figured I'm just going to call these players up and they'll talk to me. It didn't even occur to me, how am I going to find these guys? Well, we figured out a system to do that, so we started calling around. And the very first guy that I called, just by chance, was Curly Johnson's home. He was the punter. And in those days, back in the 60s, because there were only 40-man rosters, he was also the backup fullback, the backup tight end. And he could also play quarterback. He was like the fourth quarterback. You couldn't have a specialist, a punter, a place kicker, or whatever, who couldn't play other positions. So I called him up. His wife answered the phone, and I told her who I was. I said, I'm a fan. I'm not a sports writer. I've been a fan since 1963. And I remember this about your husband. And I'd like to talk with him about his Jets career and about the Super Bowl. Now, I didn't know, but I found out immediately that Curly Johnson, and this is 4 years ago, had a very bad case of CTE. And he'd been afflicted with it when he was 60, and he was now close to 80. And he could hear, but he couldn't really talk very well anymore. And she said, no problem, I'll tell you all the stories. But before she started to tell me the stories, she covered the mouthpiece on the telephone. And she said, Bob, just give me a second. And I heard her distinctly say, hey, Curly, you won't believe this, but there's a guy on the phone who wants to talk to you about the Super Bowl. And she told me that Curly Johnson had been waiting 47 or 48 years for anybody to ask him what happened that day and that year. And although I never heard that directly from any other player, the inference was there. Like, what? You want to talk to me? You don't want to talk to Joe? You want to talk to me? And that was the whole intent of my book, to talk to them. Unsung heroes. There were so many terrific players on that team. My wife told me I was having too much fun talking to these guys, and it's probably true. Jerry Philbin, who was one of my 2 favorite players, Emerson Boozer was the other. And ironically, both of them were probably the 2 toughest guys to get to talk to me, because they both immediately hit me with the thought that they had told their stories so many times over the years that they didn't really think there was anything new. And I said to both of them individually, let me tell you what I want to talk to you about that I remember about your career. I'll bet you've never been asked about it, or you certainly haven't been asked about it in 40 or 50 years. And when I laid it on each one of them, their reactions were, okay, you got me. When do you want to talk? Pete Lamons, the tight end, has become a very good friend. He's hilarious. My running line with him is, I will call up, Pete will answer the phone, and I'll say, hi, can I speak to the greatest tight end in Jets history? And Pete Lamons will not hesitate and say, hold on, let me see if he's here. He's a delight to talk to. Larry Grantham, who died last year, basically taught me about what defense is really all about in pro football. He and I would talk almost on a weekly basis, often on the day after the Jets would play, and he would tell me what he thought about the game and what he saw that the Jets were doing right and doing wrong. Paul Rochester, who was like the unsung defensive tackle on that team, he was the run stopper. Not much of a pass rusher. He was the run stopper. Great sense of humor. Very glib. Very hard of hearing, but told me great stories. Matt Snell, who hasn't really talked to the media in 40-something years, spent more time talking to me than any other player on the team. And in fact, the book even reveals why Matt Snell has not been talking to the Jets for like 47 years. And he's never told anybody that. It came as kind of a surprise to me that he was willing to talk about it. And he brought it up to me. I didn't bring it up to him. He wanted to, tell somebody and let it out. And I was, very honored that he chose me to do that. So those are some of the guys that really, left a big impression on me. Billy Baird was another one. He was a free safety. He was very undersized, very underweight. He was about 6 feet and 185 pounds, but smart as a whip. He understood the defense the Jets were trying to play, and he knew, what position he needed to be in on the field on every play, and he was always there. So he always made tackles, and he would break up a lot of passes. Very unsung. Never going to make an all-star team, but a heck of a football player.
All right, here's your chance to promote. Tell us the book, the name, or the publisher, all that kind of good stuff. Where you're going to be promoting it? You're going to sign some books? What?
Okay, well, the book is called Beyond Broadway Joe, the Super Bowl team that changed football. It is published by HarperCollins. You can certainly get it at Amazon or Barnes & Noble. I know, where I live here in Skokie, Illinois, they have copies on the shelves at Barnes & Noble because I went over and told them, you need to have some books on the shelf because I'm the author, and they do. But probably the best way is to order it online. I think it's $18.20 on Amazon right now, marked down 30%. It's about a 400-page book, but it's a very easy read. The reviews by professional book critics have been very good. The fans on Facebook and such that I interact with have given it really tremendous thumbs up. The players love the book because it really presents their side of the story that's never been shown before. And when I met the players' wives several weeks ago, they liked it even more. And I'll tell you one funny story. At least it was funny to me. I hope you'll find it funny. As I was saying my goodbyes to the players after spending a good part of the weekend with them, one guy, his name is Carl McAdams, and he was a much hurt linebacker and defensive lineman on that team, but a wonderful guy. Lives in Oklahoma, and he's a cattle farmer. And he said, Bob, I can't thank you enough. You were so kind to me in the book, and I never thought of myself as that kind of a player because I was hurt all the time and this and that. Can I do anything for you? And I said to him, Carl, you raise cattle? He said, yeah. I said, name your next calf Bob. And he said, you got it.
No greater tribute.
To me, there is no greater tribute.
Just as long as it doesn't come back as a box of steaks. Bob,
I told my rabbi, maybe we'll get a kosher one. Who knows?
All right. Thank you to Bob for a interesting conversation. Those Jets, I know it's a painful topic, right? Especially as we're recording this in early November. We're about 2 months away from what should be remembered lovingly as a great anniversary, the 50th anniversary of that amazing New York Jets Super Bowl III championship. And as you heard in our chat sort of near the end, the topic of how this team from 69, or actually the team of 68 and the championship won in early 1969, it's somewhat sore topic, I guess, frankly, of the Jets organization, the Jets team, and the fans that may remember back in the day, because undoubtedly it is a hallmark or the hallmark of the Jets franchise history. Yet, it also, in a strange way, kind of reminds people that not a whole lot of good, certainly not championship things have happened to the team since that time. As a long-suffering, not every year though, New York Giants fan growing up, it's a curiosity to me how the Jets have, stuck around in New York City sports consciousness. I think there is still that sort of shadow of the Giants, right? Of course, now they're both playing in a same stadium over at in East Rutherford at MetLife Stadium, which is a continuation of what was the past Giants Stadium prior, and the Jets being sort of the secondary tenant of that as well. So I think, you're a New York Jets fan. There is it's a bittersweet sort of discussion and memory about 1968, 1969, especially in relation to the team and what it's become or what it hasn't become in the years since. So anyway, it's a great conversation. I enjoyed it thoroughly. And the book, of course, is called Beyond Broadway Joe, the Super Bowl team that changed football. The author, of course, is Bob Lederer, our guest. It is published by Day Street, which is an imprint of, is it William Morrow? Yes, William Morrow is the major imprint of that. You can find that wherever books are found, of course. But we encourage you to do it from our website, if you don't mind, because we'll get a couple of shekels when you do that. And that's, of course, goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode. I think it's number 88. And you will find all kinds of interesting stuff related to this show, some show notes, some Jets items that might be of interest to you as well as a click away to this book as well. So feel free, please, to visit there early and often. Click through, buy the book that way, and we would appreciate it tremendously. And we also appreciate every time you come on our website to tool around. Why don't you? There's all the old episodes there. You can find all of our social media links and feeds there. That's things like Twitter, for example. You can find us at Good Seats Still. You can follow us on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. You will find the link to our Facebook page, which a good, healthy handful of you weigh in with your favorite episodes and memories. We appreciate that. You can sign up for our newsletter. We send that out every weekend to remind you that a new great episode is coming your way. And please, by all means, either before, during, or after your visit to goodseatsstillavailable.com, please rate and review us if you can. It only takes a couple of seconds, and it really helps our algorithm out there and other people to find this show. And you can share the love that way. It's probably the least expensive way to do so besides listening. And that's on Apple iTunes or podcasts, wherever you listen and have the opportunity to rate or review. By all means, please do that. And you could also, by the way, at our website, send us email. That's a good way to contact us. But also you can send that to us directly at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. That'll get to us as well. Let's see. Podcasting is fun. It's daunting. It's a lot of work, but our friends at Podfly Productions are really helpful to getting us going and on the air every week, and we appreciate them. And our good friend Jerry Payne, who puts all of our collective pieces together to make us sound somewhat smooth and interesting. And if you want to find out more about Jerry and Podfly Productions, perhaps you're considering your own podcasting interests and want to learn a little bit more or perhaps get some production help, by all means, I recommend highly our friends at Podfly. You can find them at podfly.net. All right. Thank you so much for listening. We appreciate to no end your listenership. And we'll talk to you next week, we hope, with another great episode. Take care. And until then, ta-ta.